yes, I think the sort of global hostility towards Trump's trade policy does run the risk of bringing Trump's enemies closer together, does run the risk of pushing the global south further away from anything that could be described as Washington's sphere of influence.
David Lubin, Senior Research Fellow in the Global Economy and Finance Programme at Chatham House for the World in 10. David, look, these Trump tariffs are apparently on their way. Canada, Mexico, China, we know for sure. He insists the EU too. Maybe the UK is to follow. But he talks about a $300 billion deficit in what the EU buys from the US versus the reverse. Is he talking about the right numbers? Let's just get that straight first. Can you talk to us about the sort of details here? Has he got it right? And what's the impact going to be?
There's lots of things going on. I mean, the immediate trigger, or the sort of legal trigger for the tariffs being imposed on Mexico, Canada, and China have to do with an international emergency related to the inflow of drugs and illegal immigrants into the United States. So the legal basis for the current round of tariffs is about dealing with what the White House describes as an international emergency, and it's the use of the International Emergency Economic Powers Act that allows Donald Trump to impose these tariffs immediately without going to Congress, without producing reports, without sort of getting consultation across the government. But it's questionable whether this is an immediate international emergency that, to which tariffs is the right response, particularly given the fact that we know that in the background, Donald Trump's approach to trade is intensely mercantilist. In other words, he believes that trade deficits, that when the US runs a trade deficit with another country, the US is effectively subsidizing that country, that deficits somehow emasculate the United States or limit the US's autonomy, its freedom of movement, its economic power. And so his deep belief, going back 50 years, is that trade surpluses are a path to economic power. And so the use of tariffs, even though at the moment it's cloaked in this economic emergency related to the flow of drugs and immigrants, in the background, what's going on is a deep-seated, very strongly held view that Trump holds about this emasculating effect of trade deficits. Now, that's very important in terms of answering your question about the European Union, because without question, the EU these days has the second biggest trade deficit with the United States after I think I'm right in saying that the EU actually has a bigger trade deficit these days with the United States, or trade surplus these days with the United States, than China does. So the fact that the EU so far has been excluded from the announcements over the weekend doesn't by any means mean that the EU is out of the woods. In fact, trade tariffs on imports coming from the EU, I would have thought, would be extremely likely. Other countries that have very large exports or very large trade surpluses with the United States, certainly in terms of overall numbers and in terms of a relationship to the size of their own economies, Vietnam, Thailand, other countries in Southeast Asia would be included. Whether the UK is included in this or not is more up for grabs. I mean, the fact is that the United States runs a trade surplus in goods with the United Kingdom. So, in that sense, Donald Trump should be relatively relaxed about the US's trade position vis-a-vis the United Kingdom. And he made some friendly comments in the last 24 hours about Keir Starmer. And so it's quite possible that the UK will be isolated from this effort. But the effort in the background is this, as I say, deeply held belief, rightly or wrongly, that trade deficits are a source of national emasculation, and that needs to be addressed, and it can only be addressed through tariffs.
I realise that the EU has its deal with the United States, and its members, effectively have to abide by them. But is it fair for Donald Trump to look at the EU in the same way as an individual country? Because, I mean, it's obvious that they're going to simply have more desire to import from, say, Germany and France than, I don't know, Slovenia or Slovakia in the United States. So it's difficult to punish them all, isn't it, when it's only a few countries that the US presumably is doing all this work with?
Well, I mean, the EU is a trading bloc, and so it'd be difficult, I think, for the United States administration to kind of pick and choose which countries within the EU that it wants to impose sanctions on. Just to give you the numbers, in 2023, the United States trade deficit with China was about $275 billion. The United States trade deficit with the European Union was about $175 billion. So the EU as a whole is, the United States' second biggest trade deficit, followed by Mexico and then Vietnam. And so I think that the EU itself is very likely to be a target for Trump trade policy, but it's the EU rather than countries within the EU, just because that's the nature of the trading arrangement.
Trump has spoken, I mean, since before his first term, but certainly now, about America first. I just wonder whether this is sort of potentially risking an America alone outcome almost. I mean, the other alliances, wouldn't they just get stronger by the fact that they're being targeted? I guess whether that's, for example, the EU and the UK, or Mexico and Canada, or maybe in more concerning terms for someone like Trump, would it be pushing China and Russia a bit closer together, for example?
Yes, I mean, that's ironic, given that Trump's, one of Trump's grand geopolitical objectives is to what he calls ununite Russia from China. I think the sort of global hostility towards Trump's trade policy does run the risk of bringing Trump's enemies closer together, does run the risk of pushing the global South further away from anything that could be described as Washington's sphere of influence. And so the geopolitical implications of what was announced over the weekend and what's likely to be announced over the next few months vis-a-vis all sorts of other countries are very serious indeed. What happened after the 2018 tariffs that Trump imposed on exports from China was a kind of reallocation of global trade. So, US imports continue to grow strongly because the US is growing very strongly, and US imports at the end of the day are a function of how strongly the US economy is growing. But what we saw is a kind of diversion or a reallocation of the source of US imports, not from China so much, but from other countries, Mexico, Vietnam, the European Union. And so although China's surplus with the United States declined after the US imposed tariffs on China in 2018, all that happened was, like a tube of toothpaste, the source of US imports just redistributed itself. And so the question, I think, now is whether Trump will end up playing a game of kind of whack-a-mole. If goods that had previously come to the United States from China are now coming from Vietnam, for example, either because the goods are being routed through Vietnam to avoid tariffs, or because manufacturing capacity moved from the Chinese mainland to Vietnam in order to take advantage of lower tariffs. The fact that happened in the wake of the 2018 tariffs on China will, I think, not survive, because Trump is alert to this. And so there'll be a kind of whack-a-mole process where, imports to the United States from Vietnam have risen massively because we put all these tariffs on China. Let's now put tariffs on imports from Vietnam. Let's now put tariffs on imports from Thailand. And all the other countries that have benefited from this kind of reallocation of global trade that followed from Trump's tariffs imposed on China in 2018. So the risk is that that this effort to use tariffs to change the structure of the US's trading relationship with the rest of the world is going to be a story that we'll be living with for quite some time now. Particularly given how fond we are, how much we know Trump is fond of the use of tariffs. And also, I would say, what we've learned in the last couple of weekends about about the way Trump wants to use his negotiating leverage. we saw this first last weekend with Gustavo Petro, the president of Colombia, who initially refused to accept flights of Colombian illegal immigrants back to Bogota. Donald Trump immediately went to kind of maximum escalation. He imposed immediate 25% tariffs on Colombia, with a threat of 50% tariffs in a week if Colombia didn't back down. A number of sanctions were imposed on officials traveling from Colombia to the United States. In other words, there was no messing around. The message that Donald Trump wanted to send was that, I will go immediately to the most dramatic, use the most dramatic tools I can find in order to change my adversary's behavior. And I think we've seen a similar approach in the announcements that took place this weekend with respect to tariffs on Mexico, Canada, and China, particularly with respect to Mexico and Canada, a 25% tariff. I mean, Canada's got a 10% tariff on its oil exports to the United States, but 25% on everything else. 25% tariff is extremely aggressive. Mexico's exports to the United States are equal to about 25% of Mexican GDP. When you add a 25% tax onto that scale of Mexican exports to the United States, the economic consequences for Mexico will be pretty awful. And that's been, kind of reflected in the foreign exchange market's response to the tariffs this morning. It's not, such a devastating. Well, I mean, exports to the United States from Canada are about 18% of Canadian GDP. So it's a lower level of threat to the Canadian economy, but still a very substantial threat indeed. So what Trump has done with his two neighbors represents a kind of level of aggression that's consistent with what we saw with respect to Colombia last week.
I want to continue just a little bit on the China theme. And the European Union foreign policy boss, Kaja Kallas, said this morning that the quote is, "China will be laughing if Trump manages to start a trade war between Brussels and Washington." I'm just wondering how exactly that does impact China, and why they would be laughing, I guess, especially given the 10% tariffs that he's put against China.
Well, I mean, it suits China for the West to be divided. So from that point of view, Beijing does score a strategic win with a Trump administration determined to weaken its alliances with similarly democratic powers. In a way, the big victory of the Biden administration, I think, particularly in the wake of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, was to unite the West. The display of unity, particularly over the imposition of sanctions on Russia after its invasion, was, I think, terribly unwelcome from the point of view of Beijing, because what unites the West is disadvantageous to China. And so I think what that comment that you referred to is probably getting at is that the more the US does to strain its ties with its traditional allies in the European Union, the more a kind of geopolitical advantage is scored by Beijing.
You've talked about some of the damage that might happen to Canada's economy, to Mexico's economy. I imagine similarly to, say, Germany, maybe France to a degree as well, with these tariffs. Donald Trump is continually asking for NATO members to spend more of their GDP on defence, a higher percentage. Of course, a higher percentage of a lot lesser GDP is, in actual terms, less money, isn't it? I just wonder if he's doing some real damage to his other plans by putting these tariffs against some of his major allies.
I think that's probably the case. I mean, in a way, the more immediate way of kind of asking that question that you just posed is about the United States itself. It's important to remember the answer to the question, who pays the tariffs? It's US consumers and US businesses that pay the tariff. And across the entire level of imports that the US buys from Canada, China, and Mexico, I mean, that's about $1.2 trillion worth of imports. Roughly speaking, I mean, these numbers are difficult because you don't know to what extent trade will be shrunk as a result of the imposition of these tariffs. But 25% tariff on imports coming from Mexico, on imports coming from Canada, with the exception of oil imports, and 10% tariff on imports coming from China. That's something north of $200 billion that US businesses and consumers will pay as a tariff that will be income to the US government. But that's a transfer of income from the American private sector to the American government. Now, Trump wants those tariff revenues because it will help him finance the income tax cuts that he wants to extend from after the current income tax regime ends at the end of this year. So he wants the tariff income, but the domestic economic consequences for the United States are probably not to strengthen the economy. If anything, they're probably going to weaken the economy. At the same time, the damage done to financial market confidence, we see global equity markets falling today, and the strengthening of the dollar that results from the imposition of these tariffs are also probably not good news for the US economy. So it's difficult to see who the winner is in this, except if you really, unless you really believe, as Donald Trump certainly does, that the US strategic position in the world is enhanced the smaller the US trade deficit is. That's an absolutely fundamental belief of his. Not many people, certainly not many economists, share that belief. But if he's right in thinking that, and if anyone who shares that belief will consider some economic damage, both to the US economy and the global economy, as some kind of price worth paying in order to enhance the US freedom of maneuver in the global economy as it moves from a big deficit position to a smaller deficit position.
I mean, let's hope he's right, I guess. If he is wrong and the economists that you speak of are correct, and I'm sensing perhaps you are on their side with regards to this. You asked the question there, it's difficult to suggest who the winner is. I'm wondering if the winner might be Vladimir Putin.
I think that, as I said, I think that the extent to which Trump's actions end up disuniting the West is kind of a gift to the enemies of the United States, whether that's China or Russia or the whole axis of powers that wants to upend the global order that the US has been presiding over in the last 80 years. I don't know how to allocate points, if you like, to different countries within that group, but I think that yes, as I said, the effort, any actions that end up disuniting the West are probably good news for the West's antagonists, and that includes Russia and China.
Donald Trump, obviously, you've spoken of sort of the micro point of this in his mind, assuming he is absolutely correct and it effectively is able to fund the income tax cuts that he's planning. Do you think there is a sort of macro point here, a much larger point that might impact the global economy for 50 years or whatever, that might actually keep America as the dominant force globally? Or am I missing the point entirely? Is it simply a short-term goal?
Yes, I'm sure that's what he's aiming for. The question is whether he's likely to be successful in that. The dollar is very expensive at the moment. Trump's actions in imposing this round of tariffs and whatever follows from this round of tariffs will continue to strengthen the dollar further. And the risk is that the dollar goes from territory where it is at the moment, which you could describe as being expensive but not overvalued, to territory, in the next few quarters, the next couple of years, where the dollar is more obviously overvalued. At that stage, particularly given the fact that US asset prices, the level of the equity market, the very narrow spreads that US corporates pay to borrow money, US asset prices are very elevated. And so the risk is, as time goes by, the risk is that some kind of, I don't want to say financial crisis, but some financial reckoning becomes more probable in the next couple of years. And I think that although Donald Trump thinks that he may well think that the actions that he's taking are going to strengthen the US economy, the risk is that what he's doing ends up creating an additional layer of vulnerability for the US economy.
I have just two more questions, one sort of practical and one slightly hypothetical. Let's ask the practical one first. Just about, you get Trump or a country saying something, like Donald Trump has, right, we're imposing tariffs. They come in on Tuesday morning. Justin Trudeau then has to respond, comes out and says, we're going to impose 25% tariffs back. What is the practical response? What is the work that is going on in embassies, behind the scenes right now to try and impose tariffs like this over, I don't know, 12, 24, 48 hours? Is that sort of 4 years work in 4 hours kind of thing?
Yes, a lot of the response, some of the response that countries will be mounting to these tariffs is not really in the gift of policymakers. It's in the gift of the foreign exchange market. As we've seen, the Mexican peso, the Chinese renminbi, the Canadian dollar are all depreciating, partly to offset the effect of the tariff. And so in a way, the sort of the market goes through this natural adjustment process to allow each country to kind of weather the impact of the tariffs. On top of that is, the potential for more actions like the one that the Canadian Prime Minister has announced, that, there's retaliatory tariffs, and that could lead to a kind of tit for tat process that ends to nobody's advantage. I hope that we don't end up in that kind of race to the bottom. But given that the race gun has been fired, how the race evolves is yet to be seen. And Justin Trudeau's at least given us a sense that race to the bottom is a meaningful scenario at the moment.
And just finally, a bit of a hypothetical one, I guess. There's an argument, isn't there, to say that global warming is actually the ultimate risk to global security at the moment, which is what the World in 10 is about. Maybe not a popular comment on this podcast, I imagine, given the immediate threats, but there'll be some people that are saying, if you buy from yourself, which Donald Trump's tariffs potentially might make people in China, in America, in Mexico, in Canada, in the EU do, you'd be actually going an awful long way to reducing carbon emissions globally. Is that a potential real benefit to what Donald Trump is doing here that perhaps even he isn't thinking about?
I think that's not right. In the first place, Trump's energy policy is very, very far from climate friendly, and the whole effort to address the climate emergency requires international coordination. And international coordination is very much the antithesis of Trump's America First approach. And so I don't think there's any sense in which you can argue that there's a good outcome in all of this for the climate.